The new television show called Dark Matter, starring Joel Edgerton, has a very interesting concept in relation to Eastern philosophy and spirituality, particularly the Bardo realm, that realm that we go to after death. Now, in the show, there's a concept of the corridor. Now, this is really just a box that's infinitely recurring, but when you're in that realm, it's a corridor of that single box, which is infinitely recurring, and there's many, many doors, obviously an infinite amount of doors, if you can wrap your head around that. So the corridor is infinite, right? And so in the story, when you go through a door, there is another reality, another version of yourself, another version of the world. And this, relates to superposition in quantum physics. And this type of corridor is kind of like this quantum reality, right? Where we step into this reality and there's infinite versions of ourselves and the world. And so when you go through each door, you see a different version of yourself, a different version of the world that we are all a part of. Now, what's interesting in the story is not so much these infinite worlds, but that the door that we go through, the world that we enter, relates to how we are within. Now, not just about how we are thinking, but how we are at our core. Now, this relates to Eastern spirituality and philosophy, right? Because when we enter the Bardo realm, or however you want to term that realm that we enter after death, a lot of people ask, how do we take on our new body? How do we enter a certain different womb and this and that? Now, in the teachings, particularly in Buddhism and Hinduism, how we are in our subconscious will determine the next life that we live. Now, when we look at what I call the Wheel of Samsara framework, which I speak a lot about in my book, Fasting the Mind, you have this three-part process that builds what we would say is Eastern psychology. And so you have karma, right? Now, karma is just literally action and unconscious actions. And then you have vasanas, which are latent tendencies and habitual ways. And then you have samskaras, which we would say is the subconscious. And so this is, all of the subliminal imprints you've taken, the mental impressions, all of these things that you've accumulated either consciously or unconsciously all throughout your life, which then becomes kind of the basement of your being. Right? And so there's this two-way process. So we will act in the world, which then builds the habits that we develop, which then becomes part of our subconscious. And then that affects the way that we act in the world as well, right? So that's sort of, we are trained to be a certain way and then we act a certain way. And so the spiritual process is essentially to clean out the basement, to clean out the subconscious, right? So that we can act purely in the world. But the problem is that we are the victim of our own karma, because the way we act in our unconscious reactions are based on our vasanas, right? Our habits and our latent tendencies. And so we continually act this way in the world and we continually come across conflict and this and that, which then that affects the way that we act and behave and think about the world. And the problem is that when we go through our life and we continually accumulate more samskaras because our karma and our vasanas are continually interacting their ways with the world. And so your identity is acting in this way with the world. You're accumulating more samskaras. And then when you come to death, then those samskaras will continue on into the next life. And that's why a lot of people will say that you live out your karma in your next life, or you continue to live out your karma life after life after life. It's infinitely recurring until you realize that you are that ultimate undifferentiated consciousness of Atman, which is identical with the ultimate reality of Brahman, the ultimate reality of existence. And so when you go into the Bardo realm, there's a three-phase process, right? So the first phase is like pure undifferentiated stillness. And this is probably identical with what the Atman would be. And so we enter into that state. And a lot of people say it's like an all-loving state. It's hard to describe, right? Like you enter into this state. And then what happens is if you haven't had sufficient training through your life to clean out the basement of your samskaras, then those samskaras begin to vibrate. And it brings you into the second phase where the vibration of all of your karma is there and it's vibrating. And if you don't have sufficient awareness, you haven't trained your awareness to identify with that first phase, the undifferentiated phase, then the third phase is you are pulled into the next life, into a womb, what we would call the door in the corridor, to use dark matter's concept, right? So you go through that door determined by your samskaras. So if you've lived a very toxic life, you've treated people poorly, and you've just been a terrible person in general, then the next life that you will have, no matter whether it's human or not, will be according to those samskaras. The universe doesn't discriminate, so energy just gravitates to where it should be. And so that's all it is. But if you've been a saint your whole life, maybe you'll go to a better existence in your next life. But the important part here is to completely cleanse the basement of the samskaras. Because when you enter into the Bardo realm, when you open that door of death and you enter into that first phase, then that is that undifferentiated phase. And if you have trained your awareness enough, or you've realized in some sense that your identity in this life is an illusion, and you've always had sort of a detachment from that, then when you get into that phase, it will probably feel very familiar. And then you'll abide in that, and then that's where moksha, release, and you become one with Brahman happens. And so it's not that you aren't one with Brahman now or in the next life or in infinite lives in the future, but what I'm saying is your awareness will be completely absorbed in that. And so the identification that you have bought into throughout your life doesn't even exist anymore. And so that's what I wanted to speak to you guys about today, that relationship between the show Dark Matter and its concept of the corridor and the infinite doors, and in relation to the Eastern philosophical and spiritual concept of the Bardo realm and how we choose another life. And so it's important, both, if we take the show seriously, to cleanse your mind and to prepare your awareness to go through the next door. And again, that's the same with the Eastern spiritual traditions. It's so important to train your awareness to abide as that, to abide in that undifferentiated consciousness, which is identical with Brahman. And so that's what's very important in the spiritual traditions. And I kind of find it interesting that this television show has used that concept in a different way, mind you. Like, they are alive in this kind of quantum reality, or they believe they are alive. And so how they are in that corridor determines how they are in the next life and the world around them, actually, which is very interesting, right? So when we go into our next life, how we were in our past life determines the world we end up in our next life. So that's what's really interesting. And so, as I mentioned many, many times on the channel, through many different videos, how important it is to train your awareness so that when you enter the Bardo realm, that the vibrations of your karma, your vasanas, and essentially your samskaras don't grab hold of you again and pull the jiva, the ego persona system that you think you are, back into another life. But instead, if you train your awareness, you go into the first phase and you identify as that Atman, which is Brahman, because that's who you truly are. You are not the jiva. And so once you identify as that, then there won't be another door to walk through there. You won't hang out in the corridor ever again, or in the Bardo realm, and there are no more doors to go through, because you have completely dissolved your identity. And so you have come back into the great ocean of existence, the ultimate reality of Brahman. Shanti, Shanti, Shanti.